we are following a number of significant developments in the war with Iran, which is now stretching into its sixth week. Moments ago, President Trump once again reiterated his threat to devastate Iran if a deal is not reached before the deadline he set of 8 p.m. Eastern time tonight. The President of the United States posting on social media, in part this: a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. Trump, however, is leaving the door open for a breakthrough, adding, maybe something revolutionary, wonderful can happen. Who knows? We will find out tonight. Trump has been threatening this level of devastation for weeks now, repeatedly delaying the attacks on critical infrastructure, like power plants and bridges, attacks that could amount to war crimes. But he suggested in that post, as well as yesterday to reporters, that this latest timeline, his latest deadline, is final.
John here. It matters that you showed up. On a spring morning in 2026, Trump posted an unprecedented threat of annihilation that shattered all expectations of presidential rhetoric. The post echoed through Congress, the UN, and the streets of Tehran, crossing a line that international legal experts immediately condemned. A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. Read those words again. Let them land with the full weight of their meaning. The president of the most powerful nation on earth, addressing tens of millions of followers on his personal social media platform, describing the potential destruction of an entire civilization encompassing approximately 90 million human beings, 90 million souls, 90 million lives, 90 million people who were not a military target, not a strategic objective, not a collection of enemy combatants, but an entire civilization, the heirs to one of the oldest and most influential cultural traditions in human history.
This is a critical period. They have a period of, till tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I gave them an extension. They asked for an extension of 7 days, right? I said, Steve, give them 10 days. 10 days is up actually today, so I gave them 11, I guess, indirectly. I thought it was inappropriate the day after Easter. I want to be a nice person. They have till tomorrow. Now, we'll see what happens. I can tell you they're negotiating, we think, in good faith. We're going to find out. We're getting the help of some incredible countries that want this to be ended because it affects them also. A lot of people are affected by this. But we're giving them till tomorrow, 8 o'clock Eastern time. And after that, they're going to have no bridges. They're going to have no power plants. Stone Ages, yeah. Stone Ages.
For its part, Iran says it would, quote, deprive the U.S. and its allies of the region's oil and gas for years if President Trump carries out that threat.
And he was telling the world that their death was not only possible, but probable. The message was unmistakable. Iran had not opened the Strait of Hormuz by the deadline Trump himself had established, and the consequences, as the president framed them, would be biblical in scope. The response from Capitol Hill was immediate, visceral, and unlike anything the second term had produced. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and his entire leadership team issued a joint statement that used language previously reserved for the most dire of circumstances. They called the president completely unhinged. They declared that his threat to eradicate an entire civilization shocked the conscience and required a decisive congressional response. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, never one to mince words, went further. He described the president as an extremely sick person.
Meanwhile, Iran this morning is already reporting a series of attacks on key infrastructure, saying airstrikes took out a railway bridge, a train station, and a highway bridge in cities across the country. Neither the U.S. or Israel immediately claimed responsibility for the strikes, but the IDF did earlier warn Iranians not to use trains. This comes as the U.S. conducted strikes on military targets on Karg Island. A U.S. official with direct knowledge of these events tells MS Now. This was not an oil infrastructure strike, the official stressed, describing the attack as restrikes on what the U.S. had previously hit. The attack occurred in the early morning overnight hours, East Coast time Tuesday, and we're now 11 hours from this deadline. Let's just repeat for a moment the President of the United States and his post this morning. That is threatening a war crime. That is threatening something genocidal. if he follows through with this. And perhaps it's just a bluff, perhaps it's a negotiating tactic, an 11th hour push to get the Iranians to the bargaining table. But even just issuing that threat from the Oval Office.
The international community responded with its own vocabulary of condemnation. Iran's representative to the United Nations used the most serious terminology available in international law, calling the threats incitement to war crimes and potentially genocide. The Pope, the first American to hold that position, issued a statement calling the threats truly unacceptable. And then came the wave that truly signaled the gravity of the moment. Democratic members of Congress, not just the progressive wing, not just the usual voices of opposition, but mainstream figures across the ideological spectrum of the party, began going on the record with a demand that had previously been treated as too extreme for mainstream congressional rhetoric.
Is a remarkable escalation and something we have never before seen from any president of the United States. With us, we have now MS Now senior national security reporter David Rode, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker, contributing writer to The Atlantic, Eugene Robinson, and contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, Molly Jong-Fast. Our thanks to all of you for being with us this morning. Peter Baker, I'll start with you about the president's post this morning. And we know he is, fond of over-the-top language. He is fond of, fire and fury threats and the like. But this, to me, is something entirely new. And even if it does prove to just be a bluff of some sort or a bargaining tactic, this is still a new place for a president of the United States. This is the rhetoric we associate with people like Vladimir Putin, with people like Kim Jong-un, with the monsters of history. And yet we have heard it now from the sitting president.
Yeah, absolutely right. He's using the language of war crimes in a way that no other American president, certainly in our lifetime, ever has. I mean, America traditionally has tried to occupy the high ground.
They called for Trump's immediate removal from office, impeachment, the 25th Amendment. All options were on the table, they declared, before this man starts a war that could kill a civilization. The clock was ticking. Less than 12 hours remained before Trump's self-imposed deadline, and the entire structure of American governance was being tested in ways it had never been tested before. The president had framed the conflict with Iran in stark terms. For weeks, tensions had been escalating across the Middle East. The United States and Israel had been conducting joint strikes on Iranian military and nuclear facilities as part of what Trump described as a campaign to permanently eliminate Iran's nuclear capability before it could reach the threshold of building a weapon.
When it comes to wars are fought only out of necessity, not out of spite or out of emotion or out of bombacity. And presidents, when they talk about war, talk about achieving military objectives, talk about targeting military targets, not wiping out a civilization. Wiping out a civilization is the language of war crimes, and this is going to be, as you rightly say, it's you never know with Trump, right? Obviously, this could be just him chest thumping. He likes to do that. He likes to shock. He likes to threaten. He likes to look tough. He's almost 80 years old. He wants to look like a tough guy. But it's a real test, I think, for the U.S. military at this point, because the U.S. military is bound by law not to follow illegal orders. War crimes, if that's what he ends up ordering, would be illegal. So this is what exactly those 6 Democratic members of Congress foreshadowed when they released that video a few months back, when they said that members of the military should remember that they are obligated under law to not follow illegal orders. They got punished or tried to be punished by the Trump administration for it. In fact, the Trump administration tried to literally prosecute them and throw them in prison for stating what the law says. And now, of course, that looks different in the context of what we're seeing today. And the question is, what would the military actually do when push comes?
Iran had retaliated through its network of regional proxies, through militias in Iraq and Syria, through allied forces in Yemen, and through the single most powerful asymmetric economic weapon available to it. It had closed the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, a choke point through which approximately 1/5 of the world's entire daily oil supply passes. When Iran closes the strait or threatens it with mining operations and naval assets, global energy markets convulse, oil prices spike, shipping costs skyrocket. Economies across Asia, Europe, and significant portions of American supply chains face immediate and serious supply shocks. The economic pain radiates outward, touching every corner of the globe. Trump had issued multiple escalating ultimatums to Iran about the strait in the preceding days. He had threatened to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age. He had called Iranian leadership crazy bastards. He had threatened to destroy Iran's power plants and bridges, civilian infrastructure that international humanitarian law specifically protects from targeting in armed conflict. He had even threatened to take the entire country out in one night. And then came Tuesday morning, and the post that changed everything. Iran, for its part, was responding with desperate measures. The regime had called on young people, athletes, artists, and students to form human chains around its power plants, attempting to shield critical infrastructure from American strikes. Iranian officials were issuing video appeals to the international community. The United Nations was issuing formal statements of condemnation, and before the ceasefire that would eventually come, airstrikes had already hit 2 bridges and a train station. The civilian toll was mounting. The humanitarian catastrophe was already beginning to unfold. Democratic members of Congress were rushing to microphones, cameras, and social media with one urgent message. This man had to be removed from office before his deadline produced an outcome that could not be undone. The President of the United States was posting on social media that an entire civilization would probably die that night. The United Nations was using the word genocide. The Pope was calling the threats unacceptable. Congress was demanding immediate removal. And then, in a development that would temporarily de-escalate the immediate crisis, a 2-week ceasefire was announced just 90 minutes before Trump's deadline. Pakistan's prime minister had personally appealed to the president to hold off, and Trump had agreed. But the ceasefire announcement did not erase what had happened. It did not erase the words that had been posted. It did not erase the constitutional crisis that had been triggered. And it did not erase the unprecedented wave of demands from members of Congress that the president be removed from office immediately. The specific language that members of Congress used during this crisis deserves to be examined in full, because the words they chose tell us something important about how the situation was understood by those closest to the levers of power. Senator Ed Markey urged the House to pass articles of impeachment and the Senate to convict, or alternatively for the Vice President and Cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment with Congress's support. Senator Chris Murphy said that no president in control of his senses would make such a threat, and backed the 25th Amendment as an appropriate option given what he had just witnessed. Representative Ilhan Omar wrote on social media with characteristic directness, "Invoke the 25th Amendment. Impeach. Remove. This madman must be removed from office." Representative Seth Moulton argued that even if a ceasefire was reached, it didn't erase what had happened. He insisted that Congress must oust Trump before he inflicted further harm. Representative Jim McGovern said the president's genocidal threat to commit war crimes is illegal under federal and international law, and that the House must bring up impeachment articles, and the Senate must remove a president who wants to commit war crimes. Representative Rashida Tlaib and Representative Shri Thanadar of Michigan separately called for the cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment. And House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, in a joint statement with his entire leadership team, not just a solo statement from a progressive member on the left flank, declared that Trump's statement shocked the conscience and required a decisive congressional response. This was not the fringe. This was mainstream Democratic House leadership and ranking senators going on the record to say the president needed to be removed. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. In the entire history of the American presidency, no sitting president had ever faced such a coordinated, widespread, and explicitly constitutional demand for removal from such a broad cross-section of the opposition party's leadership. The constitutional questions raised by the Iran crisis are profound and deserving of careful examination. The first is the war powers question, which had been building long before the civilization post dropped. Trump had ordered military strikes against Iran without seeking congressional authorization. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. The War Powers Resolution of 1973, passed in the wake of Vietnam specifically to limit the president's ability to wage undeclared wars without congressional authorization, requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing forces to combat and limits unauthorized military engagements to 60 days. Multiple members of Congress, including those who had introduced articles of impeachment earlier in the year, had already argued that Trump's Iran strikes constituted an unconstitutional usurpation of Congress's war-making authority. The Civilization Post added a specific additional constitutional dimension: the threat to destroy civilian infrastructure on a civilizational scale. Scholars Scholars of military law and international law were immediately clear that targeting civilian infrastructure like power plants, bridges, and civilian transportation in a way that would destroy the basic functioning of a society is a war crime under international humanitarian law. Iran's UN representative explicitly said the threats constituted incitement to war crimes and potentially genocide. The word genocide, defined under the Genocide Convention as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, is a specific and serious legal term. The Democrats who used that framing were making a specific legal argument, not just engaging in hyperbolic political rhetoric. The question of whether a president who explicitly threatened to destroy an entire civilization's infrastructure and suggested that his people might all die that night had committed an impeachable offense was a constitutional question that scholars were actively engaging with in real time. The 25th Amendment discussion deserves particular attention because this crisis pushed the 25th Amendment from the realm of theoretical constitutional discussion into active mainstream congressional advocacy in a way that previous crises had not fully achieved. The 25th Amendment, Section 4, gives the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet the power to declare the President unable to discharge his duties, triggering a process through which Congress can vote to sustain that declaration and continue the transfer of power to the Vice President. Multiple Democratic senators and representatives were specifically naming the 25th Amendment as an appropriate response to what they had just witnessed. Senator Murphy said no president in control of his senses would make such a threat, which is the specific language relevant to the 25th Amendment's unfitness standard. Senator Markey explicitly mentioned the 25th as one of the available options alongside impeachment. The theoretical problem with invoking the 25th in this context, as careful observers noted, is that Trump's cabinet members routinely praise him publicly, and the chance of them moving against him was described as low. Vice President J.D. Vance and the cabinet were Trump's people. For Section 4 to work, Vance and a majority of the cabinet had to agree to move against their own president. That is a politically and practically difficult step for officials who serve at the president's pleasure and who had shown no inclination toward breaking from him previously. But the fact that sitting United States senators were publicly and explicitly calling for the vice president and the cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment in response to a specific public statement by the sitting president about destroying a civilization is itself historically significant. This was not fringe language. This was the Senate Minority Whip and other senior members of Congress making it on the public record. The prior impeachment groundwork provides essential context for understanding the April 2026 crisis. The civilization crisis did not emerge from a Congress that had never discussed Trump's removal. It emerged from a Congress that had been building a documented record of removal demands across the preceding year. Articles of impeachment had reached the House floor in December of the previous year, producing a vote that tabled the resolution but put a significant number of members on record as wanting to advance consideration of impeachment. Those articles covered two specific charges: Trump's social media post calling for the execution of Democratic members of Congress and his sustained campaign to intimidate federal judges. Earlier in the year, more comprehensive articles of impeachment had been introduced covering Trump's unauthorized war powers actions, including specifically an article charging him with disregarding the separation of powers by usurping Congress's power to declare war by bombing another country without authorization. That article was written before the Iran Civilization Post, but its legal framework applied directly to the conduct that produced it. In that earlier vote, a smaller number of members had voted against tabling. By December of the previous year, that number had grown significantly. The trajectory was documented and moving in one direction. Each crisis, each constitutional confrontation, each episode that members of Congress felt they could not simply absorb with a press statement added names to the list of members willing to go on the record for removal. The civilization crisis pushed that trajectory further than any single event before it. The Republican response, or more precisely the absence of a meaningful one, is its own revealing dimension of this story. The headline language of Capitol Hill losing it only partially captures what happened. Some media outlets framed the backlash as fierce and bipartisan, and in one narrow sense it was. The pushback came from both sides of the partisan divide. But the bipartisan nature of the reaction was almost entirely about one side going loudly on record and the other side going conspicuously quiet. Representative Mike Lawler, a Republican from a competitive New York district who had at times shown willingness to distance himself from the Trump administration on specific issues, played down the Civilization Post by saying Trump would target only civilian infrastructure like energy systems and roads and bridges. The problem with that argument, as international humanitarian law experts immediately pointed out, is that deliberate deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure like power plants and bridges in ways that endanger or destroy civilian populations is precisely what international humanitarian law prohibits. Lawler was not offering a defense of the post by describing what Trump was threatening. He was describing the war crime that the law scholars were saying the post contemplated. The broader Republican caucus did not issue condemnations. Senate Republican leaders did not publicly call for the administration to issue a clarification or walk back the civilizational language. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries explicitly called on every single Republican to put patriotic duty over party and stop the madness. This was a direct address to the Republican caucus that received no meaningful public response from the people it was addressed to. Observers noted that despite the intensity of Democratic removal demands, the chance of Trump actually being removed was low because his cabinet members routinely praised him publicly, and there was no sign they were preparing to move against him through the 25th Amendment. Think about the absurdity of this moment. A president posts that a civilization of 90 million people will die tonight, and it probably will. The international community calls it genocide language. The opposition party calls it a war crime and demands immediate removal. The Pope calls it truly unacceptable. And the president's own party absorbs the post and waits to see what happens next. That is the specific failure of the bipartisan accountability mechanism that this crisis exposed. The civilization will die tonight post represents the most extreme publicly available statement ever made by a sitting American president about a foreign nation in the modern era of American foreign policy. No sitting American president has ever published on social media or said in any public format that an entire civilization of tens of millions of people might die that night and that it probably will happen. The specific phrasing is important to examine closely because it goes beyond aggressive rhetoric about a government or a military. A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again, is not a statement about defeating a military, destroying a government, or achieving a strategic objective. It is a statement about the permanent annihilation of a civilization as a cultural and human entity. Iran is the heir to the Persian civilization, one of the oldest and most influential in human history, spanning roughly 3,000 years of history, science, art, philosophy, poetry, mathematics, and cultural achievement that has shaped the development of the entire broader region. When Trump wrote that a civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back, he was describing the destruction of something that has existed for millennia and that encompasses 90 million living people. The international response reflected exactly how that language was read by people with expertise in international law, military law, and the legal framework for armed conflict. The UN representative for Iran said the threats constituted incitement to war crimes and potentially genocide. The Pope called the threat truly unacceptable and said attacks on civilian infrastructure violate international law and are a sign of the hatred and destructiveness human beings are capable of. Legal scholars specializing in military law were specific. Deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure in ways that destroy a population's ability to survive constitutes a war crime under the laws of armed conflict regardless of the military objective. The congressional response, the largest single wave of on-the-record removal demands in Trump's second term, reflects how the post was understood by elected American representatives who are accountable to constituencies that would bear the consequences of a civilizational war conducted by this administration without their authorization. The specific constitutional claims behind the removal demands are serious and grounded in specific legal frameworks. The members of Congress calling for impeachment and the 25th Amendment after the civilization post were not making up their legal theories on the spot. They were applying existing constitutional frameworks, the War Powers Clause, the impeachable offense standard, the 25th Amendment's unfitness provision, to the specific conduct they had just witnessed. The war powers argument had been building for months across both the Iran conflict and prior military actions Trump had taken without congressional authorization. The Civilization Post added the specific military law argument about targeting civilian infrastructure. The unfitness argument, no president in control of his senses would make such a threat, in Senator Murphy's words, invoked the 25th Amendment's language about the ability to discharge the constitutional powers and duties of the office. A president who publicly threatens to destroy a civilization and suggests it will probably happen cannot simultaneously claim to be fully in command of those duties in a way that international partners and domestic lawmakers can credit. All three legal frameworks are real. All three were being invoked by sitting senators and representatives. This was not rhetorical excess. This was constitutional argumentation about specific conduct. The ceasefire outcome does not erase the constitutional questions the crisis raised. Representative Seth Moulton said it explicitly. The ceasefire doesn't erase an impeachable offense. Trump announced the 2-week ceasefire 90 minutes before his own Tuesday night deadline, after Pakistan's prime minister directly appealed to him to hold off on the bombing. The crisis de-escalated, but the social media post remained. The threat that had been made remained. The constitutional questions about whether making that threat constituted an abuse of presidential power, a usurpation of Congress's war-making authority, or evidence of unfitness to discharge presidential duties, those questions do not resolve themselves because a ceasefire was announced. Moulton's specific point that Congress must oust Trump before he inflicts further harm reflects the specific concern that a ceasefire is a temporary condition in a conflict that Trump has demonstrated he is willing to escalate to civilizational language without congressional authorization or public deliberation. The trajectory of the removal demand movement across Trump's second term is a documented political fact that the April 2026 crisis accelerated significantly. In the previous year, a smaller number of members voted against tabling impeachment articles. By December of the previous year, that number had grown substantially. The civilization crisis produced the largest single wave of simultaneous public removal demands in the second term. Dozens to over 70 members across multiple levels of Democratic House and Senate leadership making explicit on-the-record statements calling for impeachment or 25th Amendment action. The trajectory does not need to reach the required Senate votes to be politically meaningful. It is already politically meaningful as evidence of an ongoing congressional judgment that specific presidential conduct exceeds constitutional limits. Each new crisis, each new constitutional confrontation, each new episode that pushes more members from private concern to public demand adds to a record that will shape how this administration is understood historically and how the constitutional questions raised will be resolved in law and in politics. The civilization will die tonight crisis produced a ceasefire but did not produce resolution. The Iran conflict was ongoing. The Strait of Hormuz remained contested. The military and diplomatic dynamics that had produced the crisis had not been fundamentally altered by a 2-week ceasefire agreement brokered by Pakistan. The congressional removal demands that the civilization post-produced did not disappear when the ceasefire was announced. They are part of the documented political record of this administration. On-the-record statements from sitting senators and representatives calling for impeachment and the 25th Amendment in response to a specific presidential action. That record will accumulate. The members who went on record calling Trump unhinged, an extremely sick person, a war criminal, and a madman who must be removed, those statements are permanent. They will be cited the next time a similar crisis produces a similar response. The pattern of each crisis pushing more members further toward public removal demands is the political trajectory that the coming elections will either accelerate or interrupt. Watch what happens in those elections, because that is the constitutional answer to the question that impeachment and the 25th Amendment have not been able to provide. Whether the American people want this administration to finish its term is the ultimate question that only the voters can answer.